Well, thank you, Ollie. And thank you very much for organizing this wonderful conference. And I'm very happy to be here in Helsinki for the very first time, in a country that I have actually dreamed about visiting since I was a child. I dreamed about it in the winter, but nevertheless, this is pretty fascinating. So the title of my paper is Philosophy and the Enduring Appeal of the Esoteric. In speaking about philosophy in relation to esotericism, we have to distinguish between two types of esotericism, which are distinct, though sometimes related. First, there is the esoteric style of writing, the practice of philosophers writing so as to conceal their true meaning beneath an exoteric veneer. The purpose is to make their message obscure to everyone except those truly worthy of receiving it. Leo Strauss is the scholar who is most closely associated with the study of esoteric writing. Strauss and his students have created a veritable cottage industry, writing commentaries that purport to reveal the esoteric dimensions of many major philosophical works. This remains a controversial approach. Fundamentally, however, Strauss is correct that esoteric writing has been part of the history of philosophy from its origins until the 19th century, when, for reasons we will discuss, it abruptly ceases, for the most part, to be practiced by those we will call today professional philosophers. The other sort of esotericism is, of course, what has brought us all here to Helsinki, the esotericism that has been called by a variety of other names, including Hermeticism and occultism. I am referring, of course, to Western esotericism. These two types of esotericism are quite obviously related in that many authors we recognize as part of the history of Western esotericism endeavored to conceal their their teachings through esoteric writing. Strauss was certainly aware of this, and he mentions it briefly in Persecution and the Art of Writing. I will discuss both types of esotericism. To avoid confusion, I will refer to Strauss's sort of esotericism as esoteric writing. When I refer to esotericism, I mean, unless the context makes it clear, Western esotericism. Western esotericism has also been a preoccupation of philosophers, well before that term or any of its synonyms existed. Indeed, before there was any distinction between philosophy and esotericism at all. In effect, that distinction was made in the modern period by Protestant and Enlightenment rationalist scholars whose intent was to expunge esotericism from the history of philosophy. Nevertheless, as we will see, even after their work was done, esotericism still manages to creep back into philosophy. And it is at that point that our two senses of the esoteric converge. Because Western esotericism had been anathematized in the modern period and declared pseudo-philosophy, philosophers who were interested in esotericism were forced to write about it esoterically. That is to say, they had to conceal their interest. I will offer three examples of this: Kant, Schelling, and Hegel, all of whom took steps to cover their tracks. In what follows, I will discuss all the above matters, as well as some important lessons we might learn from them. Let us begin with the practice of esoteric writing. Strauss's hermeneutic approach is quite controversial. Many scholars today strongly resist the idea that canonical philosophers engaged in esoteric writing. Strauss and his students are thus accused of reading esoteric doctrines into philosophical texts. One of the most basic reasons their approach is so controversial is that if taken seriously, it ought to lead to a radical reconsideration of what we believe we know about the views of major philosophers. But scholars have a great deal invested in the belief that certain doctrines were held by Plato, Aristotle, Descartes, Kant, and others. They are thus outraged, and this is no exaggeration, by the suggestion that some of those doctrines are merely exoteric. There are other reasons for the resistance of scholars to the Straussian approach, which we will touch on later. In truth, the historical evidence greatly favors Strauss's position. There is abundant testimony throughout history from philosophers themselves that they engaged in esoteric writing. Beyond that, this fact was taken for granted by almost every author writing about the history of philosophy, once again up until the 19th century. This was especially the case in treatments of ancient philosophy. The political scientist Arthur M. Melzer has written an extremely valuable study of this history titled Philosophy Between the Lines: The Lost History of Esoteric Writing. He marshals overwhelming evidence in support of the thesis that until very recently, philosophers actively concealed their true meaning. While Melzer is influenced by Strauss, ultimately, he makes a more convincing case for the Straussian approach than Strauss himself ever made. Melzer writes, quote, through most of its history, philosophical esotericism has not been a curious exception, it has been the rule. It has been a near constant accompaniment to the philosophic life, following it like a shadow, end quote. And further, quote, the single most striking thing about the testimonial evidence for esoteric writing and philosophy is in fact not its quantity, but its universality. It just shows up everywhere. It is in fact difficult to name a single major philosopher from any time or place before 1800 who did not somewhere make open and approving reference to this practice regarding either his own writings or those of others or both. It would be impossible to sum up all the evidence Melzer presents for this claim, as there is simply too much of it. As an indication of how widespread the belief was that philosophers practiced esoteric writing, he cites the fact that Diderot's encyclopedia, published beginning in 1750, mentions esoteric writing in no fewer than 28 articles by multiple authors. One article, titled Esoteric and Exoteric, is exclusively devoted to the topic. The author, Samuel Formey, states that, quote, the ancient philosophers had a double doctrine, the one external, public, or exoteric, the other internal, secret, or esoteric, end quote. Melzer notes that the author treats his thesis, quote, as non-controversial, a matter of general knowledge, which indeed it was, end quote. In 1720, the rationalist philosopher and freethinker John Toland published Kleidophorus, or Of the Exoteric and Esoteric Philosophy, that is, of the external and internal doctrine of the ancients. Lest we get the impression that modern authors thought the practice of esoteric writing was exclusive to the ancients, Toland insists in his text that it is, quote, practiced not by the ancients alone, for to declare the truth, it is more in use among the moderns, although they profess it is less allowed, end quote. Indeed, there are, of course, simply too many esoteric readings of canonical philosophers to discuss here. But let us consider just one, Plato, as a paradigm case. In his 7th letter, the authenticity of which is now accepted by most scholars, Plato insists that he never actually wrote his philosophy down, despite, of course, having written around 35 dialogues. One of these, the Phaedrus, speaks of the necessity of writing in such a way that one's meaning is concealed. It is a very significant fact that Plato wrote dialogues rather than treatises. The reader cannot assume that any character in the Platonic dialogues speaks directly for their author. And many of the dialogues end seemingly without any definite conclusions about the ideas under discussion. The reader must therefore work to discern what Plato's real point is. But most readers, including many scholars of ancient philosophy, aren't willing to do that. Much of modern scholarship on Plato makes the naive assumption that we may simply take whatever Socrates says as conveying Plato's own views. In fact, Plato's Socrates is an ironist who speaks in different ways depending upon who he is talking to, sometimes expressing very different views. The failure to recognize this leads to the condescending assumption that Plato just kept changing his mind. We must also consider the reports of Aristotle, Simplicius, Alexander of Aphrodisias, and other ancient commentators concerning Plato's so-called unwritten doctrine. This was a Pythagorean-influenced metaphysical teaching, arguably the first systematic philosophy in history, which purported to explain all of reality in terms of two ultimate principles called the one and the indefinite dyad. Let us now raise the question of the motivations of Plato and other philosophers for engaging in esoteric writing. Why did they, to quote John Toland, accommodate the surface level of their writings to, quote, popular prejudices and to the religions established by law, end quote? One reason was to protect the philosopher from persecution by the mob. Philosophers have always challenged orthodoxy and so-called common sense, and have thus risked censorship, ostracism, or even death. The fate of Socrates is sufficient proof of this if any were needed, and Socrates' trial and execution may have been what motivated Plato, his student, to engage in esoteric writing. A second motivation for esoteric writing was also protective, only the intention was the reverse, to protect the common people from philosophers. Since the time of Socrates, it has been recognized by philosophers themselves that their thoughts are dangerous to society. Why? Precisely because philosophy calls into question popular prejudices and religion, which, so ancient and medieval philosophers believed, are the very basis of society itself. Aristophanes' Clouds is a comedic illustration of philosophy's potential to undermine society. The Socrates of the play, quite unlike Plato's Socrates, is presented as both a sophist and a natural philosopher. He corrupts his students by teaching them that it is vortex, not Zeus, that moves the clouds, thus undermining religious belief. He also teaches them how to make the weaker speech the stronger, thus encouraging a kind of relativism. And in the end, one of his recent graduates strikes his own father, an offense that was considered particularly heinous by the Greeks. The concerns of the ancients about philosophy were justified, and we must concede that it was not entirely without good reason that the Athenians turned on Socrates. Modern philosophers also believe that philosophy is inherently transgressive and has the potential to undermine social order. The difference is that the ancients believed that undermining the social order would be a bad thing. They recognized a disjunction between theory and praxis and believed that one cannot found a society on reason. Lest one think that Plato's Republic constitutes a counterexample to this claim, I should mention in passing that the Straussian reading of this dialogue, which takes it as a reductio of the idea that one can found a society on philosophical principles, is particularly convincing. In contrast to the ancients, modern philosophers typically believe that the traditional order needs to be undermined by philosophy, in whole or in part, precisely because they believe in the possibility of a society based on reason. The root cause of this difference between ancients and moderns has to do with two strikingly different conceptions of human nature. The ancients believed in natural inequality. They distinguished between the few and the many, or the wise and the vulgar. These are fundamentally different sorts of people, and so the ancients believed they are born, not made. To these sorts of people, different sorts of lives are appropriate. The vast majority will follow popular prejudice and official religion and never even think to question these. It is only the few who will do so, and thus only the few who are suited for the philosophical life. The recognition of this difference is to be found among the earliest philosophers. The famous allegory of the cave in Book 7 of the Republic depicts one man's process of coming to seek truth by freeing himself from opinion. The second part of the allegory, which is not as widely remembered, depicts what happens when he returns to the cave and attempts to free his friends. Socrates says that the best case scenario is that they will laugh at him. But he asks Glaucon, his interlocutor, quote, if they were somehow able to get their hands on and kill the man who attempts to release and lead them up, wouldn't they kill him? No doubt about it, replies Glaucon. And so it always is. The many reject the wisdom of the few, and that wisdom cannot reform society, let alone build a new one, because all societies are necessarily caves ruled by half-baked opinions, prejudices, and superstitions of all kinds. Thus, the only solution for the philosopher is to get out of the cave entirely, or if he must continue to live in it, to speak in one way to the few and in another way to the many, as Aristotle describes his great-souled man as doing. The distinction between the many and the few and how it necessitates secrecy was universally affirmed by Western philosophers into the modern period. In the modern period, however, the belief that the division between the wise and the vulgar is natural, that is, that it is the result of heredity, eventually comes to be rejected. Gone is the Platonic idea of congenital soul types, which Socrates expounds in the Republic. Instead, the ideal of human equality is affirmed, something the ancients would have found absurd. If Hegel is to be believed, modern egalitarianism has its ultimate origin in the Christian teaching that all men are equal in the sight of God. At first, this egalitarianism is modest in its claims, seeking only such things as equal treatment before the law. But when it is combined with the Enlightenment blank slate theory, which claims that all differences between men are the result of nurture rather than nature, we are led to the inescapable conclusion that the dichotomy between the many and the few can, in principle, be overcome. The vulgar can become wise, and everyone is a potential philosopher. This ethos, which has become more radical over time, still reigns today in the West, especially in America, and it is considered elitist and undemocratic to challenge it. Still, many modern philosophers continued to practice esoteric writing, both to protect themselves from persecution and because they felt that public enlightenment had to be achieved gradually by doling out the truth in small and sugar-coated doses. Around 1800, however, there is a noticeable trend away from philosophical esotericism. This is true in two senses. First, fewer philosophers seem to engage in deliberate esoteric writing. Second, esoteric readings of major philosophers begin to go out of style. And eventually we arrive at the situation I described earlier, where even the idea that philosophers ever had engaged in esoteric writing becomes controversial. Why does this take place? First of all, after 1800, almost every modern philosopher of note is an academic, whereas before that date, few were. Machiavelli, Descartes, Hobbes, Locke, Berkeley, Hume, and Rousseau, none were professors, and they wrote for a general audience. From Kant onwards, philosophy is written primarily by academics and aimed primarily at an academic or academically trained audience. The result is that the major writings of philosophers become mostly incomprehensible to ordinary people. The professionalization of philosophy thus generates a new, de facto esoteric writing that persists to this day. There was no longer any need for philosophers to deliberately conceal their meaning from the public, because for the most part, only specialists could read them. This was, of course, especially true of the Germans. Ironically, however, many of the German philosophers wished, in fact, to be understood by the public. With the obvious exception of Nietzsche, the German philosophers of the 19th century mostly embraced the Enlightenment egalitarianism I discussed a moment ago and were enthusiastic about the project of public enlightenment. This is, of course, highly ironic given the obscurity of their writings, but this obscurity was not intentional. Far from deliberately muddying their waters, as some have alleged, notably Schopenhauer, the German idealists struggled in vain to express themselves clearly. A notable case of this is Fichte, who continually revised his major work, The Science of Knowledge, in order to clarify its ideas, and who issued a number of popular works. Later on, I will argue for a kind of esoteric writing in 19th century German philosophy, but mostly what is concealed are the philosophers' sources rather than their beliefs. Then there is the question of why esoteric readings of older philosophers fell out of fashion. This was probably due in part to the tendency to anachronistically read contemporary philosophical standards or practices back into older authors. Another reason for the decline in esoteric reading probably has to do with the fact that scholars imprinted by modern egalitarianism find the traditional distinction between the wise and the vulgar to be offensively elitist, They are thus loath to acknowledge that their favorite philosophers could have written their works with this distinction in mind and then deliberately tried to hide their meaning. This is, of course, a completely irrational approach, given the mountain of evidence in support of the tradition of esoteric writing, but it shouldn't surprise any of us. Melzer refers to what he calls the forgetting of esotericism and notes that, quote, the modern worldview somehow involves a deep aversion to esoteric writing that cannot be dispelled by evidence, end quote. As Walter Hanegraaff and others have pointed out, the modern self-conception was constructed in part through the anathematization of Western esotericism, through the banishment of the quote-unquote irrational. And it would seem that that self-conception also requires the rejection of esoteric writing, motivated as it was by the belief in natural inequality. Fundamental to the modern worldview is, of course, the belief in progress. But if human inequality is natural and ineradicable, if the overwhelming majority of men cannot ever make it out of the cave, then progress in human affairs, at least, would seem to be impossible. Therefore, modernity must reject esoteric writing and its presuppositions. I turn now to the subject of philosophy in relation to Western esotericism. The truth is that prior to the latter half of the 17th century, there is nothing in the history of ideas corresponding to our distinction between philosophy and esotericism, or to the firm distinction we try to make between philosophy and mysticism. The works of Pythagoras, Parmenides, Empedocles, Plato, Plotinus, Porphyry, Iamblichus, the Hermetists, the Gnostics, Eckhart, Cusa, Ficino, Pico, Bruno, Spinoza, and Leibniz all seem to us moderns to be heavily mystical, and all of them were influenced directly or indirectly by mystical, esoteric, or initiatic sources, though this is a controversial claim in several cases. Some of these men, such as Pythagoras and Empedocles, even claimed supernatural powers. For more than 2,000 years, philosophers stubbornly refuse to conform to our modern image of them as hyper-rationalists and skeptics. The distinction between philosophy and what we call esotericism today is first made via the efforts of Protestant historians such as Jacob Thomasius, Aragot Daniel Kohlberg, and especially Johann Jakob Brücker. This is a story told in detail by Walter Hanegraaff in his book, Esotericism and the Academy. It was the aim of these historians, acting effectively as a Protestant inquisition, to distinguish so-called true philosophy from what they saw as false philosophy. In the identification of false philosophy, they in effect constructed the modern category of Western esotericism. And as Hanegraaff notes, the common denominator of false philosophy is that most of it has its roots in the pagan pre-Christian worldview. The work of these historians simultaneously established the modern history of philosophy as we know it, as well as modern standards of what constitutes genuine philosophy, with genuine philosophy constructed in conscious opposition to the irrationalism of Western esotericism. Writing of Brücker's Historia Critica Philosophiae, Hanegraaff states that, quote, the importance of this work can hardly be overestimated. It became the indispensable reference for the history of philosophy, not only in Germany, but over the whole of Europe throughout the 18th and even into the 19th century, end quote. The result of this banishment of the esoteric was that eventually the interest of earlier philosophers in these matters was mostly forgotten by scholars, leading, as Hanegraaff puts it, quote, to endless cases of historians showing deep embarrassment about the fact that their objects of research so often failed to live up to modern standards of rationality. For those modern philosophers who, swimming against the current, still took an interest in these now disreputable subjects, there was enormous pressure on them not to acknowledge this. This pressure came from a fact already noted, that after 1800, it was increasingly the case that most philosophical works were produced by professional academics. As we are all aware, survival in academia is not just about publish or perish. One must also be careful about challenging academic orthodoxies. The nature of these orthodoxies, of course, changes over time. But there are always certain views one is simply not permitted to express in academia, and approaches one is not permitted to take. One challenges these orthodoxies at one's peril. Arguably, the prohibition on taking a philosophical interest in esotericism is as strong today as it was in the time of Kant, Schelling, Hegel, and Schopenhauer, four great philosophers who nevertheless delved deeply into matters esoteric, and who I will now briefly discuss. This is a subject about which I have said quite a bit elsewhere. Here I will confine myself exclusively to the ways in which the German philosophers dissembled their interest in esotericism. Of the four philosophers just named, three actively concealed their interest in esotericism at various points in their careers through the practice of writing esoterically. The exception is Schopenhauer. He published two substantial essays discussing quite openly his interest in animal magnetism and spirit seeing, treating these in relation to thinkers like Paracelsus, Agrippa, Burma, and Jane Lead. Schopenhauer even discusses an experience he himself had with precognition. Because he is so open about his esoteric interests, Schopenhauer does not figure in my account beyond this brief mention. Why was he so open? Almost certainly because he had abandoned any hopes for an academic career long before these essays were published. Let us consider first the case of Kant's interest in Emanuel Swedenborg, which presents us with a paradigm case of esoteric writing about esotericism. In 1766, Kant published a short book entitled Dreams of a Spirit Seer Elucidated Through Dreams of Metaphysics. The spirit seer in question was Emanuel Swedenborg, the Swedish scientist, mystic, and theologian. The tone of Dreams is wry and dismissive. As a result, it has been almost universally accepted that Kant took up Swedenborg simply in order to debunk him. In 2001, however, Gregory R. Johnson defended an important doctoral dissertation, as yet unpublished, arguing that Dreams is a classic example of esoteric writing. As Johnson puts it, quote, Kant constructs his text on two levels, placing his criticisms of Swedenborg in the center, while subtly negating or qualifying them in the margins, intimating his serious interest in and positive debts to Swedenborg between the lines, end quote. Johnson makes his case through a line-by-line reading a la Strauss, and there is simply too much of it to summarize here. I will mention, however, one important piece of evidence for his interpretation to which Johnson devotes an entire chapter. This is Kant's letter to a young woman named Carlotta von Knobloch, dated August 10th, 1763, in which Kant demonstrates that at von Knobloch's urging, he had expended a great deal of time, trouble, and money investigating Swedenborg's reputation as a clairvoyant. He even employed a friend of his, a merchant with business in Stockholm and Gothenburg, to investigate stories of Swedenborg's clairvoyance, visit Swedenborg himself, and deliver a letter from Kant. Kant makes it clear that these investigations convinced him of the authenticity of Swedenborg's powers. As he reported to von Knobloch, he was eagerly awaiting Swedenborg's reply to his letter. There is no evidence that Swedenborg replied, actually, as well as the 8 volumes of Swedenborg's Arcana Celestia, for which Kant paid a considerable sum. However, rumors of Kant's investigations into Swedenborg began to circulate. This was a problem for him, given that Swedenborg was just the sort of visionary stigmatized by the historians mentioned earlier. He was, in short, not the sort of author that any self-respecting modern philosopher should display interest in. Kant was a humble lecturer at the time, not a professor. Too keen an interest in Swedenborg would have endangered Kant's academic career from 2 quarters, the Enlightenment and theologically orthodox Christians. Kant cleared his name by writing Dreams, but even after its publication, he treated Swedenborg respectfully in his lectures on metaphysics as revealed by student notes. Why did Kant take an interest in Swedenborg? The letter to von Knobloch makes it clear that Kant was interested in clairvoyance as such, but beyond that, in the 1760s, Kant was wrestling with how to understand the place of free will, moral responsibility, and human dignity within a deterministic material universe. Swedenborg offered one picture of how that is possible, claiming that human beings straddle both material and spiritual worlds. Swedenborg's idea that space and time are merely forms of perception became central to Kant's critique of pure reason, and his idea of the spiritual world as a moral kingdom of ends became central to Kant's moral philosophy. But the tone of dreams misleads the reader, most likely deliberately, into believing that Kant is wholly dismissive of Herr Swedenborg, as Kant deliberately misspells his name. In other words, in dreams, Kant accommodates his views to academic prejudice and covers his tracks through the practice of what Melzer calls protective esotericism, except that he is not protecting himself from the mob, but from other academics. I turn now to Schelling and Hegel, who I will discuss only very briefly, as I've covered the same information in much greater detail elsewhere. Schelling had a very strong interest in matters esoteric and mystical, primarily the Christian theosophical tradition of Jakob Boehme and the visions of Swedenborg. Schelling was also well acquainted with the works of the Christian theosophist Friedrich Christoph Oetinger. There is some controversy as to how far back the influence of theosophy goes in his works. However, its influence on Schelling's later philosophy, produced after he left Jena in 1803, is absolutely unmistakable. The influence of Boehme on the 1809 essay, Philosophical Investigations into the Essence of Human Freedom, the last major work Schelling published during his lifetime, is so extensive and so obvious that it is beyond dispute. At times, Schelling's position is virtually indistinguishable from Boehme's. He even employs the term Ungrund, which was coined by Boehme and is exclusively associated with his theosophy. Yet not once in the Freedom essay does Schelling so much as mention Boehme's name. In several other texts following the Freedom essay, Schelling continues to draw on Boehmean ideas. There is also clear evidence of the influence of Oetinger. In The Ages of the World, written between 1811 and 1815, but only published posthumously, Schelling at one point quotes Oetinger, but without attribution. Schelling's 1810 Stuttgart lectures also draw upon ideas Oetinger adapted from the Lurianic Kabbalah. Yet in neither of these texts are Boehme and Oetinger mentioned by name. Ernst Benz has even demonstrated that Schelling borrowed material from Oetinger's works, but without attribution. For example, Schelling employed idiosyncratic translations of biblical passages made by Oetinger, but without crediting him. Schelling eventually does mention Boehme by name, but only in his lectures and very late in his career. Schelling's interest in Swedenborg was awakened not by Kant's Dreams of a Spirit Seer, but by Oetinger's 1765 work, Swedenborg's and Others' Earthly and Heavenly Philosophies. Schelling's contemporaries reported that in private conversation, he unequivocally expressed belief in Swedenborg's powers. He appears to have become especially interested in Swedenborg and in the existence of the spirit world upon the death of his wife Caroline in September 1809. Between 1810 and 1820, he made various attempts to develop a philosophy of the spirit world. Schelling's dialogue Clara, subtitled by his son Karl on nature's connection to the spirit world, is very clearly influenced by Swedenborg, and Friedemann Horn has demonstrated that several passages in Clara are virtually quotations from Swedenborg's 1758 work, Earths in the Universe. And yet not once does Schelling mention Swedenborg by name in this text or anywhere else. Even Schelling's letters contain no direct references to Swedenborg. Significantly, Schelling requested that the manuscript of Clara be destroyed upon his death. Fortunately, his son disobeyed these instructions and published it instead. As to Hegel, his lectures and personal notes from his Jena period show a very strong interest in Boehme. Hegel's Lectures on the History of Philosophy, which were not published until after his death, include a lengthy chapter on Boehme. In this text, Hegel continually compliments Boehme on his profundity. Ultimately, however, he is careful to distance himself from the theosopher, criticizing him for the barbarity of his mode of expression, given that Burma thinks in terms of images rather than abstract concepts. Most Hegel scholars seize on these comments to argue that Hegel decisively rejects Burma, which might be the reaction that Hegel himself was hoping for. However, Hegel's private notes from the same period tell a different story. The posthumously published Jena fragments show the philosopher freely drawing on both the ideas and the vocabulary of Burma in developing the outlines of his philosophical system. These texts are replete with Burmean imagery. Their language and spirit are reflected in the Revealed Religion chapter of the 1807 Phenomenology of Spirit, completed at the tail end of Hegel's Jena period. Unsurprisingly, Burma is not mentioned in this text. Only quite late in his career does Hegel clearly acknowledge his interest in Burma. In other words, once his academic position was secure and he had become the leading philosopher in Germany. For example, in the preface to the 1827 edition of the Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences, written only 4 years before Hegel's death, he briefly discusses Burma's importance, referring to him as this mighty spirit. Incidentally, in the same preface, Hegel includes several admiring references to Franz von Baader. Another Burma reference occurs in Hegel's late revision of the Science of Logic, published in 1832, the year after his death. In the original edition of 1812, Hegel had obliquely referred to Burma without naming him. In the revision, the same passage has been altered, and Burma is now explicitly mentioned. For whatever reason, Hegel had decided against referring to Burma by name in the original version. The revised edition corrects the omission, thus more openly acknowledging Hegel's interest in Burma. Finally, mention must be made of a passage in the preface to the Phenomenology of Spirit. Notoriously, Hegel attacks Schelling in the preface, calling his absolute the night in which all cows are black. Hegel then offers his own conception of the absolute, saying, the true is the whole, das Wahre ist das Ganze, one of the most famous lines in the history of philosophy. In Hegel and the Hermetic tradition, I make the case that this is virtually a quotation from Oettinger, whom Hegel, of course, does not name. My suggestion is that Hegel knew that Schelling would understand the allusion. I maintain that Hegel is exhorting Schelling to abandon his conception of the absolute as abstract indifference point and to fully embrace the developmental conception of God to be found in the Christian theosophical tradition exemplified by Burma and Oettinger, and with which Hegel knew Schelling to be familiar. If I am correct, then this constitutes a classic example of esoteric writing on Hegel's part. Now, what lessons can we learn from all of this? I believe that there are many, but I can only speak of a few. And in what follows, I will address myself to the few, primarily to philosophers. And for the most part, I will speak openly. I have spoken about two senses of esotericism in relation to philosophy. The exploration of both of these has far-reaching consequences. First of all, as I noted earlier, coming to terms with the ubiquity of esoteric writing in the history of philosophy ought to lead to a radical reconsideration of what we believe we know about the views of many canonical philosophers. Second, the thesis that our modern conception of philosophy was constructed in conscious opposition to what we now call Western esotericism ought to lead to a radical reconsideration of the nature of philosophy as such. This reconsideration obviously must involve a fresh look at the currents of philosophical thought that were declared irrational and unphilosophical in the modern period. In other words, to rethink what philosophy is must involve rethinking esotericism. In both cases, philosophy is reconsidered in light of the secret. On the one hand, there is the secret dimension to the text. The fact that most modern scholars have missed that dimension has resulted in a radically flawed account of the history of philosophy. That is to say, of what the great philosophers really meant. On the other hand, there is the dirty little secret of the history of philosophy, its suppressed connections to the irrational. It is the second case that has the more radical implications. For as I have said, it must lead us to consider whether we really understand what philosophy is at all. To rethink philosophy in the light of Western esotericism means that we must be willing to entertain the possibility that there is truth to be found in what has been dismissed as superstition, charlatanry, and pseudoscience. In this paper, I have discussed 4 excellent role models who exemplify the open-minded philosophical approach to esotericism that I recommend: Kant, Schelling, Hegel, and Schopenhauer. We are thus in very good company. The task we face is akin to setting off on the exploration of a lost continent with a vast terrain. It is tremendously exciting, not least because it is transgressive. But philosophy is by its nature transgressive. It is my belief that the most important characteristic of the true philosopher throughout all of history is not rationality or analytical ability, but a kind of Faustian pursuit of wisdom, one that respects no boundaries of any kind, including disciplinary boundaries, delving into any and all matters that might increase understanding. One must be willing to question one's most cherished presuppositions, including presuppositions about philosophy, and one must be willing to entertain forbidden thoughts and to explore forbidden subjects. The true philosopher respects no pieties. I favor what I call an anarchic approach to philosophy in the spirit of what Paul Feyerabend recommended for the sciences in his manifesto against method. In other words, I believe that there are no rules in the pursuit of wisdom and that nothing is off limits. In truth, philosophers have always recognized that there are multiple routes to wisdom. The ancient quarrel between poetry and philosophy involved philosophers claiming that theirs was the surest path to wisdom, not denying that there was any wisdom to be found in poetry. Plato himself was both a poet and a myth maker. Similarly, Hegel accepted the claims of art and religion to truth, contending only that truth was most adequately expressed in philosophy. And he contended that the standpoint of his own philosophy would have been impossible had it not first been revealed in mythic form by the Christian religion. Throughout the history of ideas, the borders between the different approaches to wisdom have been porous, and philosophers have always been attracted to the forbidden and to the secret. As we have seen for much of its history, philosophy itself was a secret, concealed from the eyes of the vulgar through esoteric writing, because philosophers dared to think thoughts forbidden by their societies. The inherent problem with sanctioning the expression of certain ideas is that individuals with the most active and open minds will always be drawn to the possibility that those ideas are forbidden precisely because they are true. This must be at least partly why Kant, Schelling, Hegel, and Schopenhauer were attracted to esotericism. They were quite open to the possibility that certain thinkers had been cast out of the history of philosophy not as a result of enlightenment in the true sense, but as a result of ignorance and bigotry. To make a further very important point, rethinking philosophy and esotericism in the way I am suggesting simultaneously involves a rethinking of modernity as such. This may already be obvious. Our modern self-congratulatory self-understanding is built partly on the idea that we have progressed beyond the quote-unquote irrational. Our conception of reason itself has been constructed in opposition to this, and thus our basic standards, not just for the academic disciplines, but for the conduct of our own lives. Our understanding of the world around us and our place within it, our modern metaphysics, if you will, is arguably an inversion of the fundamentally pagan worldview of the esoteric traditions. But philosophers must be prepared to entertain the possibility that our modern metaphysics has got things wrong. We must entertain the possibility that our entire way of looking at the world and at ourselves may be fundamentally misguided, and that we have not made philosophical progress in understanding the universe and our place in it, but just the reverse. I am only suggesting this as a possibility, but the true philosopher will not shrink from considering it. At the very least, we must come to grips with the fact that our cherished modern isms materialism, relativism, historicism, atheism, egalitarianism, and other isms are not universal values, and that all are, for one reason or another, problematic. In fact, they are the values of only a very small portion of humanity and have been proclaimed for only a tiny fraction of human history. Indeed, we need not go to the other side of the globe to encounter ways of looking at the world that constitute reproaches to modernity. We need only delve into our own past. To engage with the history of ideas is to engage with thinkers who espouse views fundamentally at odds with our modern outlook. Philosophers and others will only learn from those thinkers if they are open to the possibility that they have something to teach us, and that their views, however strange and outmoded they seem, might be true. They might be right, and we might be wrong. For philosophers to approach the history of ideas with any other attitude is simply a smug, self-congratulatory waste of time. One modern ism in particular makes true philosophical engagement with the history of ideas impossible, namely historicism. For my purposes here, I will define historicism as the position that all thinkers are products of their time and place, that truth is relative to time and place, and that no thinker may escape his historical situatedness in order to glimpse some trans-historical truth. There are many problems with this position, beginning with the obvious fact that the truth of historicism, if indeed it is true, is trans-historical. The theory is offered as timelessly true of all historical periods, in other words, and is not offered merely as a theory true in its own time. Historicism is thus asserted from exactly the sort of privileged trans-historical position that the theory itself declares impossible. At present, however, I am less concerned with the logical problems with historicism, serious though they are, than with the problems historicism poses for the philosophical study of the history of ideas. First of all, to engage with that history prior to, say, Hegel, is to entirely engage with thinkers who were not historicists and believed that trans-historical truth was possible. We will learn absolutely nothing from their works if we approach them with a dogmatic historicism. Instead, we must consider in each case whether there may be something to their claims to know or to be able to discover trans-historical truth. Second, the practice of esoteric writing poses a significant problem for historicism. Recall that, generally speaking, esoteric writing involved thinkers concealing positions that were at odds with their society beneath an exoteric veneer of orthodoxy. But a conflict between philosophy and society is possible only if philosophy is not just a product of its time. If philosophy is unable to overcome its historical situatedness, if it is unable to think differently, then there is no danger of it clashing with the rest of society. Thus, there is no need for esoteric writing. Yet there is a need because there is just such a clash. Therefore, philosophy is able, at least to some extent, to overcome its historical situatedness. The approach I am suggesting, rethinking philosophy in the light of its historical relationship to esotericism, is dangerous because, as I noted earlier, it entails a complete rethinking of the modern worldview. This is dangerous to modernity, but it is also dangerous to us because, like all human beings throughout history, we live in the cave. We academics, most of you are academics, aren't you? We academics, however, live in two caves. There is, first of all, the cave of society, with all its prejudices and its myths, the chief myth of today's cave being that we have freed ourselves from myth. But then there is, to borrow a phrase from Leo Strauss, the cave beneath the cave. This is the cave of the intelligentsia, the academic cave. The ancient distinction between the few and the many, or the wise and the vulgar, does not neatly map on to the distinction today between academics and non-academics, or the educated and the uneducated. There is a few and a many within the academic cave, which, as I have alluded to already, has its own dogmas, myths, and pieties. I personally experienced much more pressure to conform in the academic cave than I ever did in the other cave. Most succumb to this pressure. A few manage to climb out, not in the sense of leaving academia, although that happens too, but in the sense of freeing their minds from its orthodoxies. But woe unto him who returns to the cave and tries to free the others, for they shall deny him tenure and promotion. Fundamentally, we are still in the position of Kant, Schelling, and Hegel, who had to conceal or downplay their interest in esotericism. If, like them, we take a philosophical interest in these subjects, then we may have to practice esoteric writing as well. We shouldn't kid ourselves that this isn't happening in academia today. In my time, I have known or known of many academic philosophers, including some very prominent ones, who took a strong interest in matters mystical and esoteric. Most of them downplayed or actively concealed it. A notable exception was a former colleague of mine who, in the years following tenure and promotion, took an unconcealed interest in just about every New Age fad imaginable. No academic publisher would touch his work, and while he was well liked in our department, no one really took him seriously. We don't want to share the same fate. So if your philosophical interests involve delving into forbidden and rejected ideas and movements, it may be necessary to write and to speak esoterically. But as we have seen, this is how it has always been, and if the ancient philosophers are correct, how it always must be. Thank you.